Welcome to 15 Minutes of Feminism, part of our On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine platform. As you know, we report, rebel, and we tell it just like it is. And on all of our shows, we center your concerns about rebuilding our nation and advancing the promise of equality. And as you know, when we are doing 15 Minutes of Feminism, we dive right in. And in this episode, I'm with a guest that we've had on before. We really appreciate him. He is Dr. Jackson Katz, a regular Ms. Magazine and Ms. Studios contributor and creator of the 2020 documentary, The Man Card, White Male Identity Politics from Nixon to Trump, which was recently released in a newly revised and updated version. We talk about that in this episode, and what we really dive into are the ways in which the various forms of masculinity are coming up for discussion right now in the countdown to the election. The work that you've done has been so critically important for our understanding about how men and boys are navigating our society. So I'm so grateful that you are joining me in this conversation. So you've been writing a lot about how masculinity has been influencing the lead up to the 2024 election. And of course, so much has dramatically changed in the lead up time. More dramatically with now the Vice President Kamala Harris replacing Joe Biden as the Democrats' nominee. So let me start off with this. How do you think that change has influenced how those on the right go about leveraging masculinity in their rhetoric about campaign strategy?
Well, first, Michelle, thank you very much for having me back on. This is a great honor and opportunity for me. So thank you for that. Wow, it's just kind of unbelievable what's been happening in this election. And, you know, the argument that I've been making, that I've been writing about, making films about for a long time is that the Republicans have understood that a central part of their appeal is not just to white people, but to white men and men who are threatened by and frustrated by and resentful of feminist gains. So it's not just, you know, sort of backlash against civil rights and racial justice that animates the rise of the right over the past half century, but it's also backlash against feminism and the LGBTQ revolution. And the Republicans have understood this both implicitly and explicitly for a half century, and the Democrats are only now beginning to figure it out. And when, for example, when Kamala Harris announced that Tim Walz was her vice presidential pick, I was elated. Many people were, because I thought, okay, finally somebody gets it. Somebody at the highest levels of the Democratic Party gets that you have to explicitly appeal to men, and especially white men, through narrative, through symbolism, through reaching out, through it's not about policy, because my argument is also that it's never really been about policy. It's been about identity. And so I think this election, so many things are happening around identity, but specifically around, in the case that I'm focusing on, white men's identity. And Trump in the 24 Republican National Convention, and the Trump administration, not the administration, but the Republican National Convention was just so over the top, focused on a celebration of a certain kind of cartoonish hypermasculinity. They literally played "It's a Man's World" by James Brown as Donald Trump walks out into the arena with his little patch on his ear from the assassination attempt. They made no, you know, bones about it. It was like you're voting for a man, the savior of the country, who's tough enough to claim back or reclaim America that's been lost to the forces of liberalism, feminism, you know, wokeism, whatever you want to call it, and what they consider degeneracy. And I mean, Hulk Hogan coming onto the stage and you know, and ripping his shirt off, and I mean, yes, that was like literally over the top cartoonish, but that was only an exaggeration of what was really happening. And then when Kamala Harris became the nominee, after the Democrats successfully sort of moved beyond Joe Biden, then because she's a woman, this brings sort of gender into center stage again. But the interesting thing is that normally a woman's presence in a political campaign at this level would call attention to gender in a way that had been invisible prior. But because Trump is such an over the top sort of hyper masculinist actor, gender had already been highlighted. Kamala Harris's entry made it even more complicated.
So I'm wondering how you perceive the two debates. There was the first between Joe Biden and Trump. Shortly thereafter, Joe Biden stepped down after calls for him to do so. And there was much conflict over that. But there was a debate. And then there was a follow-up debate after Kamala Harris received the nomination from the Democratic Party. So two debates. How do we understand that through this lens of masculinity?
Sure. Well, let's be clear. Debates in the modern era have almost never been about policy. They are theatrical performances, and I've written they're essentially masculinity contests where it doesn't matter who knows more than the other person, who has more of a grasp of policy. In fact, that can actually backfire for the Democrats if the emphasis is on how much they know about the various issues, how articulate they are, because that has not been the decisive factor in how people measure success or failure in debates. It's all about performance. And again, the performance is one-on-one in outside of the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump debates in 2016, and then the Kamala Harris Trump debate here in 2024, every debate has been between men, mostly between white men. And it's therefore judged as a contest between men in a kind of, with boxing metaphor as the reigning metaphor used by the commentariat to talk about the success or failure of the various candidates. Did he land a knockout punch? Was he able to parry with counter punch against the jab that this candidate successfully launched? I mean, it's embarrassing. To me, I'm embarrassed by this, but this is how it works. And I mean, for example, during the Ronald Reagan presidency, Reagan would study lines. He would actually write lines and study them. And, he's an actor who was very good at delivering lines. And he knew that what mattered not was grasp of policy. He knew, for example, when he was debating Jimmy Carter in 1980, when he was debating Walter Mondale in 1984, both of those men were much smarter than Reagan, knew much more about policy than he did. But he studied, he understood that it was about lines like, for example, there you go again. Or I'm not going to make age, I'm not going to make my opponent's age an issue, his youth and inexperience an issue. He knew that people would then grasp onto those lines and say, oh, Ronald Reagan won the debate. Nothing to do with policy. And yet the Democrats think, okay, I got to show up and be smart and be able to point to all these programs that I have, and these policy issues. It's not about that. Anyhow. And by the way, Biden, when I watched Biden, I mean, I'm not alone in this. I know that a lot of people did the same thing. It was like, from the first moment, it was like a disaster. And it was not because of what he said. Like, if you read the transcript, you're not getting the point. The point is not about that Biden was articulating positions that made more sense than Trump. It was how he came across. And by the way, when it comes to male voters, if you listen to the discourse in Podcast America, in the Manosphere, in right-wing talk radio, on Fox News, since Biden became president, and then increasingly over the last couple of years, there's just open mockery of Joe Biden's masculinity, open mockery of his command, not just his command of sentence structure, but his like sort of
power. Which, on that point about sentence structure, it also seems to me the mocking of a disability as well, which we've seen with this, that real men, bold men, aren't vulnerable. They don't have disabilities. Or none that one could see. I saw that. I know you're going to make this other brilliant point, because all the points you make are brilliant. But I think we also saw that at the DNC convention when Waltz's son stands up and said, I love you, Dad. And then suddenly it seemed as if there was real animosity against this and against his child. It was stunning, the level of vitriol. In fact, it was really quite chilling and horrific what was targeted at this young boy standing up with tears in his eye, mouthing that he loved his father.
Yes. And I would say the reason for it, the big overarching reason for it, is that Tim Walz is an extraordinarily powerful threat to the Republicans framing themselves as the party of men and the party of strong men and real men. And anything that they can do to take him down, to make it seem that he's not the man that he is being presented as, is a way they're going to take that. So, for example, almost from the moment that he was announced as Kamala Harris's vice presidential running mate, right-wing media attacked his credentials in the military, which is a repeat of the swift boat attacks against right-wing swift boat attacks against John Kerry in 2004, because they knew the smart Republican strategists, among them Roger Ailes, in the 2004 election, knew that John Kerry's status as a combat veteran of Vietnam was one of the most powerful sort of identity pieces that he had to try to pull back some of the white male voters to the Democratic Party, because they could say, I identify with this guy. He's a combat veteran. He has the support of the firefighters union. Even though John Kerry was from an upper class background, he did have some markers of sort of masculine and in a hegemonic sense, masculine status and achievement. And they knew that. And so they went after him. And by the way, Chris Lasavidas, one of the people who was the instigators of the Swift Boat ad campaign in 2004 against John Kerry, is also a senior advisor to the Trump campaign. So they knew, for example, that Tim Walz's military record as a highly accomplished non-commissioned officer in the Army National Guard was something that would give a permission structure to white men who are identified with military, with sort of kind of masculine, traditional masculine pursuits. He's a gun owner, he's a hunter. They knew that all that would be damaging, because it would give white men a permission structure to vote for the Democrats. So they attacked him at his greatest strength. And so I think this thing with his son, it was more like, what angle can we use to undermine Tim Walz's claims to fatherhood, to patriotism, to military valor? All of those things are things that they understand to be constitutive parts of why they roll the table with white male voters every election cycle at the presidential level. And they know that they have to get overwhelming majorities of the white male vote, especially the high school educated white male vote, to win the election. And so anything that's going to undermine their radical majorities among that demographic is a threat that they have to then counteract.
In fact, in thinking about the DNC, what you've said on Walz in a piece, Tim Walz, a DNC speech was a masculinity themed populist pep talk. And you say that in particular, his identity as a conventional Midwestern white man who hunts, fishes, and was highly successful football coach might just be the perfect complement to that of his running mate, Kamala Harris, who clearly has formidable political skills of her own, right? And so with that, you were noting that he was an ideal selection as a vice presidential running mate.
Yes, and again, we have a big country, right? 50 states, and we have an electoral college, and which means that Kamala Harris has to win the votes, majorities in places like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, which have really large percentages of white voters and white male blue collar voters who vote overwhelmingly in the last half century on the presidential level for the Republicans. And so there has to be a way to cut into that radical majority that the Republicans have been gaining with those white male voters. And so the Tim Walz pick was, I think, explicitly focused on that piece of it and beyond. I mean, Tim Walz has a number of political skills, and I appreciate that very much. But I think a big part of it is what I'm talking about. And I think what I think the Democrats haven't figured out until now is that you have to play you have to understand and appreciate what's happening with white male identity, and can't just push it off and say, we're focused on other things. We're focused on people of color. We're focused on getting women out. We're focused on expanding the sort of the palette of the American pluralistic experience. That's all great stuff, but white men still make up a third of the electorate. And if you lose them, for example, the way that Biden did in 2020, he lost among white high school educated men something like 71 to 28 or something like that. I mean, Trump just ran the table with white male voters, especially high school educated white male voters in 2020. It's really hard to counteract that, especially in the battleground states, if you don't cut into that majority. And I think the Tim Walz pick and some of this narrative about patriotism, about strength, about about traditional masculine sort of ideology.
Doesn't it also just look like he has her back? I mean, so something that I think is also really important to put on the table: men who can support women and who can do so in such a way where it doesn't seem that somehow they are threatened. One gets that sense from Tim Walz, and I'm sure your research probably shows something in that. What does it take? What are the certain skill sets that a man has when he can stand by, support, and be proud of standing by a woman? It seems that Tim Walz embraces or seems to embrace some of that. It comes across, at least, as people are saying.
Absolutely. And I think this is, again, it's a critical piece of what has to happen, because honestly, in the right-wing media ecosphere, which I pay very close attention to and have been for decades, they mock men who support women's rights. They mock men like me. I mean, most of my work is men's, engaging and mobilizing men around men's violence against women and supporting basic, gender equity issues and feminist issues. People like Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, they mock men like me as if we're somehow weak or soft or have these ulterior motives. And listen, if you think about the men and young men who are supporting Trump, they're not listening, I'm sorry, to Ms. podcasts. They're not reading books about gender equity and intersectional feminism.
They're not listening to my podcast, Jackson.
Not yet, Michelle.
Not yet.
That's the next project. But they're not taking women and gender studies classes on college campuses. They're not engaging at the level that many of us engage on these issues. They're listening to Ben Shapiro. They're listening to social media clips. They listen to Tucker Carlson interviewing some neo-Nazi. I mean, they do things like that. And the ones who are more politically engaged are engaged in podcasts and social media discourse, but they're not exposed to sophisticated feminist ideas, and much less ideas about how men can retain their strength and their integrity, and at the same time support feminism and support feminist efforts and policy positions. In fact, what they hear is the opposite. They hear that men who are supportive of feminist projects are emasculated cucks, wimps, soy boys, and virtue signalers who can't get laid, basically. I mean, unless they curry favor with women by,
does actually go back to sex. I've got to get you back on this show again, and without the kind of gap of time that we've had. So we're coming near the close, and we always ask about what's the silver lining. And so keep that in mind as I ask you one question before that. So I'm wondering, do you think that the mobilization of groups like White Dudes for Harris signifies a kind of shift in the public perception of what it means to have a left wing? Is there such a thing as left wing masculinities? And how much does this stand to actually impact election outcomes?
Well, to me, the biggest issue in this election is gender. Okay, I don't think it can be overstated. I think this election is gonna hinge on whether more women come out. I'm making a dramatic statement for effect, but so I know there's nuance to this. Whether more women come out to support Kamala Harris than men come out to support Donald Trump, and I think yes, we can parse that a little bit, but I think overwhelmingly this is about gender, and the gender gap is enormous. By the way, the gender gap among young people 18 to 29 is enormous. It's like the biggest gender gap across the board is the gender gap among young voters. And I'm involved in an initiative called the Young Men Research Initiative. We're trying to call attention to how the Democrats and progressives and feminists need to pay much closer attention to narratives that reach young men, because young women are moving to the left, young men are moving to the right. And in part, they're moving to the right because they don't feel welcomed, they don't feel embraced, and they don't feel like they're part of the sort of the progressive and feminist and multiracial coalition going into the future. I think they are part of that coalition and need to be more, but we need to narrate that more effectively. So I would think, in a hopeful way, I think if we can, over the next couple of months, until the election, if we can figure out ways to talk publicly, not just you and me, obviously, but anybody who has the ear of young voters, as well as more generally, can say, yes, there is a place for white men in the Democratic coalition. Yes, there's a place for white men who support women's rights. We welcome you. Tim Walz is a perfect example of that. He's literally the embodiment of that. That it's not a measure of your weakness. This is so absurd. It's a measure of your strength if you're a man, that you support gender justice and don't see it as a threat to your very identity. That's actually a form of weakness rather than strength. And so I think framing it positively, like I always do, is we need more young men, we need more men who have the strength, the self-confidence, the moral courage to speak up and support justice and fairness and gender equity and women candidates. And it doesn't diminish our manhood. This is so absurd on so many levels, but we can't just bat it away and say that it's absurd. We have to actually, as we always say, meet them where they are. We have to talk to men. We have to talk to young men. One last thing about this. I made a film that just came out. I mean, literally today, we're releasing it today, a happy day, but it's called—
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's called The Man Card, 50 Years of Gender Power and the American Presidency. And it's all about how over the last 50 years of presidential campaigns, gender has been a central subtext, and now it's risen to being in the foreground, but it's always been present. And by making it visible, I think, by talking about it, like you and I are doing right now, it undermines the power of the right to frame these issues in a way that alienates men, especially white men, and brings them back into the progressive coalition.
Jackson Katz, it is always such an incredible pleasure being with you. We ask our guests each episode what they see as a silver lining. And so I'm wondering, in these times, how do you see a bright future ahead?
I really think that like the Harris campaign has been able to articulate, there is a newfound sensibility among people on the progressive side of the House that recapturing this notion of American experience and the American project as a small d democratic project, racially diverse society, and on a large scale, which has an enormous footprint in the world. Because I travel all over the world, and obviously what happens in the United States is incredibly important to people around the world. But we have this opportunity going forward in this incredibly diverse society that we live in to model that we can actually live together with each other across all these differences. And I think that the piece that I take some comfort in, obviously, is the leadership of women and people of color and LGBTQ. Obviously, that's been an incredibly positive giant step forward over the last couple of generations. But I do believe, whether it's white dudes for Harris or other men who are coming forward, we do have a constituency of men who haven't had a very unified voice. They've been individually supportive of women or people in their intimate relationships, or they've donated to campaigns and everything else, but they haven't had a public and visible voice to articulate some of these things. I think that if we build it, they will come. In other words, I do believe that there's an awful lot of men out there, including white men, who have felt really uncomfortable, not just uncomfortable, they've been outraged by the Trump years and by Trumpism and by MAGA, but they haven't really had a way to articulate that outside of supporting others. And I think if we can give them a platform and a voice in some organized fashion, I'm hopeful that will be the tipping point for the progressive coalition that could then have a supermajority that could then enact social legislation that could benefit everybody, including, by the way, those very same white men who have seen right-wing social policy as somehow their ally when it in fact is not their ally. So I'm hopeful that if we do this right, we can build this expanded coalition and actually get some things done in this country. And by the way, Kamala Harris, like for me and for many white men, have been elated for the last several weeks since her ascension to the nomination. And I think that that's a hopeful sign as well. It's not just people of color. It's not just women who are thrilled by this moment in our history. It's all of us. And I think there's reason for hope in that.
Dr. Jackson Katz, who is a regular Ms. contributor and also has a new film out about the man card. You all have to find it at your universities, host it, bring them there to talk about it. It is always a pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much for spending time with me on our On the Issues podcast and 15 Minutes of Feminism, which is never counted in traditional terms. We count our minutes in feminist terms. Thank you so much, Jackson.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Guests and listeners, that's it for today's episode of On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine. I want to thank each of you for tuning in for the full story and engaging with us. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode where we'll be reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. For more information about what we discussed today, head to MsMagazine.com and be sure to subscribe. And if you believe, as we do, that women's voices matter, that equality for all persons cannot be delayed, and that rebuilding America and being unbought and unbossed and reclaiming our time are important, then be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin at Ms. Magazine in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, wherever it is that you receive your podcast. We are ad-free and reader-supported. Help us reach new listeners by bringing this hard-hitting content in which you've come to expect and rely upon by subscribing. Let us know what you think about our show, and please support independent feminist media. Look for us at MsMagazine.com for new content and special episode updates. And if you want to reach us, please do so. Email us at ontheissues@MsMagazine.com. We do read our mail. This has been your host, Michelle Goodwin, reporting, rebelling, and telling it just like it is. On the Issues with Michelle Goodwin is a Ms. Magazine joint production. Michelle Goodwin and Kathy Spiller are our executive producers. Our producers for this episode are Roxy Zoll, Oliver Hogg, and also Allison Whelan. Our social media content producer is Sophia Panagrahi. The creative vision behind our work includes art and design by Brandy Phipps, editing by Natalie Holland, and music by Chris J. Lee.